if you remember what's going on in the life of Paul now, Paul, compelled by the Spirit, you recall in Acts chapter 19, has been called to go to Jerusalem. He doesn't know what awaits him other than tough times and imprisonment. And the Spirit has been working through other people who love Paul, and they've even asked him not to go. They're so worried about what's going to happen to him there. But Paul has made up his mind. This is what God is calling him to do, and so he carries with him a contribution from some of the Gentile churches. He takes it to the Jewish church in Jerusalem. He gets there, he meets with James and the other elders of the church in Jerusalem, and they come up with a plan to try to make peace with the people there who have a bad impression of Paul's ministry. And in spite of all of that, they see him in the temple. Rumor begins to circulate that he had taken a Gentile into the temple, and all Jerusalem is in an uproar. And the Romans actually have to step in and rescue Paul from a mob that was trying to literally kill him. And so Paul, being Paul, as they're carrying him away, says, "Hey, can I have an opportunity to speak to this crowd?" He begins to preach to the crowd, and they listen to him up until the point that he talks about the fact that God had called him to take the gospel to the Gentiles. And then the crowd is in an uproar again. And so the Roman guards take him aside, and they decide the only way they're going to come to the truth is to torture Paul and to scourge him. And as they're stretching him out to do that, Paul reminds them that he is a Roman citizen. And that puts the fear of God into these Roman guards. And so they take him aside again, and they now have him in the barracks. And as I talked about before, this begins a period of Paul's life that is going to last a few years, where Paul is in prison for this whole time. And a group of Jews take a vow among themselves that they won't rest or eat until Paul has been put to death. Well, as good fortune would have it, Paul's nephew gains wind of this and shares that with Paul and shares it with the Romans in charge. And so they come up with a plan. They're going to take Paul out of Jerusalem, and they're going to take him to Caesarea, where he can stand trial before the Roman governor to try to figure out what to do in light of this whole scenario. And so that's where we pick up in Acts chapter 23. And there's a few sections we're going to work through this morning. Instead of having every verse on the screen as I've done in the past, because we're working through so much text this morning, I'm just going to read through it, and I want to encourage you to follow along in the Scripture. And so this first section is from Acts 23, beginning of verse 23, up until verse 35 of Acts 23. So let's read through this together. Acts chapter 23, beginning in verse 23. It says, "Then he called two of his centurions and ordered them." This is the Roman guard in charge of what's going on here. He says, "Get ready a detachment of 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, and 200 spearmen." This is 470 guards that are going to accompany Paul. He's taking this very seriously. He wants to make sure that Paul, who he now understands as a Roman citizen, is able to get a fair trial. And he says, "Take them and go to Caesarea at 9 tonight. Provide horses for Paul so that he may be taken safely to Governor Felix." And he wrote a letter as follows: "Claudius Lysias, to his excellency Governor Felix, greetings. This man," referring to Paul, "was seized by the Jews, and they were about to kill him, but I came with my troops and rescued him." Now pause there for a moment. Is there anything this guy's leaving out in this story? Maybe the detail where he was going to have Paul scourged in order to get the information out, right? This is a very convenient way to frame this letter, right? I rescued Paul, just so you know. I rescued him, but I wanted to know why they were torturing him and accusing him, so I brought him to the Sanhedrin, and I found that the accusation had to do with questions about their law, but there was no charge against him that deserved death or imprisonment. When I was informed of a plot to be carried out against this man, I sent him to you at once, and I also ordered his accusers to present to you their case against him." And so Paul is taken to Caesarea, and he's going to stand trial before Felix. So it says, "The soldiers, carrying out their orders, took Paul with them during the night, brought him as far as Antipatris, and the next day they took the cavalry to go on with him while they returned to the barracks. When the cavalry arrived in Caesarea, they delivered the letter to the governor and handed Paul over to him. The governor read the letter and asked what province he was from. Learning that he was from Cilicia, he said, 'I will hear your case when your accusers get here.' Then he ordered that Paul be kept under guard in Herod's palace." And that takes us to chapter 24. And now Paul is going to stand trial before Felix. And what is going to unfold over the next few chapters is that Paul has an opportunity to stand before several people in positions of authority. First Felix, then Festus, another Roman governor who would come after Felix, and even Herod himself. Eventually, Paul would be taken to Rome, where he would even have trial before Caesar himself. And we're going to talk more about what all that means here this morning. But the accusers arrive, and now Paul is standing before not just Felix, but the Jews who are bringing an accusation against him. And the first thing we're going to find here is the charge that is brought against Paul. And just so you understand what's going on, the Jewish authorities have determined that Paul must be put to death. He is that much trouble that the only fair thing to do is to put him to death. But just like we learned in the trial of Jesus, when we talked about that all those months ago in John's gospel, the Jews don't have the authority to do that. They cannot bring the death penalty to someone without Rome giving approval for them to carry out that process. And so they must go to Rome for Rome's approval. And so they're smart enough to know we have to bring an accusation against Paul that will elicit a certain response from the Roman authorities. They need to be convinced that Paul is such a threat, not just to us, but to Rome itself, that they have no choice but to agree with us that the death penalty is appropriate. And so they bring with them a very skilled lawyer who's going to lay out an argument against Paul. And in a nutshell, the argument is that Paul is a threat to Rome itself. And so this is what we read about starting in chapter 24 in the first 9 verses here. So follow along with me if you would. It says, 5 days later, when the high priest Ananias went down to Caesarea with some of the elders and a lawyer named Tertullus, and they brought their charges against Paul before the governor. When Paul was called in, Tertullus presented his case before Felix. And so this is what he says. These are the charges. First of all, we have enjoyed a long period of peace under you, and your foresight has brought about reforms in this nation. Everywhere and in every way, most excellent Felix, we acknowledge this with profound gratitude. He's buttering him up. But in order not to weary you further, I would request that you be kind enough to hear us briefly. We have found this man to be a troublemaker, stirring up riots among the Jews all over the world. He is a ringleader of the Nazarene sect and even tried to desecrate the temple. So we had no choice but to seize him or arrest him. By examining him yourself, you will be able to learn the truth about all these charges we are bringing against him. And the other Jews joined in the accusation, asserting that these things were true. So if you just take a closer look at the actual accusations brought against Paul, what is the case this lawyer is bringing before Felix on behalf of the Jewish authorities against Paul? You think about these 4 things. Number 1, he's a troublemaker. And that term sounds kind of silly to us, as if it's almost lighthearted, but it's anything but. This is a charge of sedition. And that was a charge that would have carried with it the death penalty. He is a threat to Roman authority. That's the charge. He is, in essence, a public enemy. Number 2, he's a political agitator everywhere he goes. And to be fair, thinking about everything we've learned about Paul and his missionary journey so far, is it kind of true that trouble seems to follow Paul wherever he goes? Yes, and that's their charge against him. Just listen to us about Paul's life and his ministry. Everywhere he goes, he stirs up trouble. Now, that's not entirely fair, because Paul's goal was not to stir up trouble, was it? But trouble found him wherever he went. And so that's their point. Look, this is the evidence you need. Just follow this man's pattern. Everywhere he goes, trouble follows. Number 3, the accusation isn't just that he's a Christian, but he is the ringleader of a sectarian movement, the movement of the Nazarenes. These people who follow Jesus the Nazarene. And what's the implication there? Remember Jesus. What happened with him? He caused such an uprising in Jerusalem that what did Pilate have to do? Put him to death. And here comes Paul, a ringleader, not just a member of that movement, but the leader of that movement. And he's going to do the same thing. He's going to stir up trouble. And you're going to have no choice but to do the same thing. And then number 4 is he tried to desecrate the temple. Now, not that a Roman governor would have a whole lot of concern over the Jewish temple, but he does have concern over what happens as a result. And the point is, when Paul came to Jerusalem, a riot ensued. And that was because of what we thought he was trying to do to the temple. Now, never mind the fact that Paul wasn't doing anything. He's going to talk about that in just a moment. But that's what happened, is a riot ensued in the temple, and the Roman authorities had to step in and put an end to it. Now, why is this a legitimate case to bring against Paul before a Roman governor? Because from a Roman governor's perspective, he's been given one job, and that is to make sure Roman peace is maintained in this area. And so if they can convince the Roman governor that Paul is an actual, real, credible threat to Roman peace, then they can maybe convince him to deliver Paul over to be put to death. And so that's the case that they bring against Paul. But let's read what follows. Now, Paul is given an opportunity to defend himself. And so we pick up in verse 10. This is what Paul says. When the governor motioned for him to speak, Paul replied, I know that for a number of years you have been a judge over this nation, so I gladly make my defense. You can easily verify that no more than 12 days ago I went up to Jerusalem to worship. It's only been 12 days since he arrived in Jerusalem. In other words, I haven't even had that much time to cause this much trouble. That's his first thing. But then he goes on, he says, my accusers did not find me arguing with anyone in the temple, or stirring up a crowd in the synagogues, or anywhere else in the city. And they cannot prove to you the charges they are now making against me. However, I admit that I worship the God of our ancestors as a follower of the way, which is called a sect. I believe everything that is in accordance with the law and what is written in the prophets. And I have the same hope in God that these men themselves have, that there will be a resurrection of both the righteous and the wicked. So I strive always to keep my conscience clear before God and man. After an absence of several years, I came to Jerusalem to bring my people gifts for the poor and to present offerings. I was ceremonially clean when they found me in the temple courts doing this. There was no crowd with me, nor was I involved in any disturbance, but there are some Jews from the province of Asia who ought to be here before you and bring charges if they have anything else against me. Or these who are here should state what crime they found in me when I stood before the Sanhedrin, unless it was this one thing I shouted as I stood in their presence. It is concerning resurrection of the dead that I am on trial before you today. And so Paul's defense consists of three different points. Number one, he in fact did not cause any trouble in Jerusalem, either in the city, in the synagogues, or in the temple. And is that fair? And is that true? It absolutely is. Why did Paul go to Jerusalem? As he reminds them, I went to bring an offering to my people in Jerusalem. I went with the sole purpose of worshiping in Jerusalem, and everything I did was in accordance with the law, and I was not trying to stir up any trouble, and that's all true. Number two, his dedication to the way, as they referred to it, is in no way a violation of his dedication to Judaism. So again, one of their accusations that he is the ringleader of this sect of the Nazarenes, right? He says, yes, I am, but my dedication to the way, my being a dedicated follower of Jesus is actually not a violation of my dedication to Judaism. In other words, he's trying to get them to see something, that his dedication to Jesus is in fact a result of his dedication to Judaism. Jesus did not come to create trouble in Jerusalem or to tear down the Jewish way of life. He is a fulfillment of all those promises God had made. This is what we talked about last week. So the fact that he belongs to the way, that sect that they're referring to, does not make him an enemy of the Jewish people. And number three, this one's simple. From a legal perspective, they can't prove their accusations. Actually, the people who first started all the trouble in Jerusalem and accused him of bringing a Gentile into the temple aren't even there. So the primary accusers aren't even there in that setting to bring the accusation and the charge against him. And so the whole case falls apart because of that, is the point that Paul is making. So that's the defense he gives in trying to defend himself against his accusers. But then this is what happens as a result of that. So let's pick up in verse 24 and read through the end of the chapter here. So starting in verse 22, it says, Then Felix, who was well acquainted with the way, adjourned the proceedings. And when Lysias, the commander, comes, he said, I will decide your case. He ordered the centurion to keep Paul under guard, but to give him some freedom and permit his friends to take care of his needs. So Felix has heard everything that the accusers have to say. He's heard everything Paul has to say. He says, just give me some time to deliberate. Several days later, Felix came with his wife, Drusilla, who was Jewish. Now, Drusilla is actually the youngest daughter of Herod Agrippa I, so she's well connected in the Jewish world. It says he sent for Paul and listened to him as he spoke about faith in Christ Jesus. And a remarkable thing happens. Paul is on trial here, but in the midst of this trial, he's given an opportunity to do what? To preach. To preach Jesus, and to preach Jesus to this man in position of high authority in the Roman government. Amazing how that happens, isn't it? So Paul's given this opportunity to preach Jesus to both Felix and his wife. And it says in verse 25, as Paul talked about righteousness, self-control, and the judgment to come. So he's not just talking about Jesus, but all the implications of who Jesus was and what it might mean for Felix as a result of who Jesus is. And so he's talking about things like what? Like righteousness, self-control, and the judgment to come. And as Felix is listening to all this, what's his reaction? It says Felix was afraid. And it reminds me of when Pilate was putting Jesus on trial and trying to get information out of Jesus, and what seemed maybe like a trivial matter at first, as the realization of who Jesus was claiming to be and what that meant started to grab hold of Pilate, it became very heavy on Pilate's heart, didn't it? And the same holds true here for Felix. Felix is scared because of the implications of the things that Paul is preaching about. And so his reaction is this: that's enough for now. You may leave. When I find it convenient, I will send for you. And I know this isn't the whole purpose of this text, but I do find it interesting how many parallels I think a lot of us have seen to this in our own life, where you share the gospel with someone, and suddenly the weight of the gospel begins to weigh down on them, and there is a little bit of fear because they start to realize what this might mean for them. And then the reaction is one of two things. Either people are really, really moved by the gospel, and the gospel takes hold and their life changes in a moment, and repentance and confession follow, or what happens? What happens with Felix here? Which is what? This desire to put an end to the conversation, and I will come back to it when it is, what's the word he uses? When it's convenient. And if we're only willing to listen to our Creator when it's convenient for us, then we will never allow the weight of what he has to say to fully wash over us. And that seems to be what happens with Felix. At the same time, it says, he was hoping that Paul would offer him a bribe, so he sent for him frequently and talked with him. So Felix is somewhat moved by what Paul's preaching, but not enough to really change. And his primary motivation is he keeps putting it off, hoping that he's going to get a bribe out of this whole thing. And it says in verse 27, when 2 years had passed. So give me a few days turns into 2 years. Paul is waiting for some kind of conclusion to this trial. It says, when 2 years had passed, Felix was succeeded by Porcius Festus, but because Felix wanted to grant favor to the Jews, he left Paul in prison. And so for 2 years, Paul sits in prison in Caesarea, frequently having conversations with Felix, but reaching no conclusion to the trial that he was put on 2 years prior. And so when we get back to this next week, we're going to see what happens is now Festus takes over for Felix, and now Paul's got to start all over again in this process. But I want you to think about something critically with me this morning. And this is something I want to challenge you to think about over the next few weeks as we work through the last few chapters in the book of Acts. And it's this. Go back to Acts chapter 9, when Paul is first called on the road to Damascus. As Ananias is trying to make sense out of what God is asking him to do, to reach out to this man that had just been persecuting the church, Jesus says to him, Ananias, go, this man, Paul, is my chosen instrument to proclaim my name to the Gentiles. Now, we've talked a lot about that. Paul takes ownership of that. That is his ministry, to proclaim the gospel to the Gentile people. But also, what does he say here? And to their kings. That Paul has been called by God specifically to speak to men in positions of power. To speak to their kings, to their rulers, to those in positions of authority, and to the people of Israel. I will show him how much he must suffer for my name's sake. And I just want to remind you that what happens here at the end of Acts is Paul is able to to preach to 2 Roman governors, 1 Jewish king, and all the way to Rome and have an audience with Caesar himself, that's all part of what God had in mind for Paul from the beginning. This isn't accidental. This is what God has in mind for Paul. If you look at Acts chapter 23, it says, the following night the Lord stood near Paul and said, this is on the heels of all the kerfuffle in Jerusalem, take courage, as you have testified about me in Jerusalem, so you must also testify where? Rome. Well, why Rome? What's in Rome? Caesar's in Rome. The man who holds more power and authority than anyone in the world is in Rome, and God is calling on Paul to take the gospel even there. And as you think about that, I want you to ask this question. Why was it important? Why was it so important for Paul to witness before those who were in positions of power? Why was that part of what God had called Paul to do? And I want you to think about that question over the next few weeks as we wrestle with some of these texts. If you go back to John chapter 19, I want to remind you of a dynamic that unfolds as Jesus is before Pilate, another Roman governor, trying to figure out, like Felix is here, what to do with this Jewish troublemaker. Pilate has just heard from the Jews that Jesus is claiming to be the Son of God. And like Felix, Pilate gets a little bit afraid because of that. And so Pilate asked Jesus, where do you come from? And Jesus gave him no answer. Do you refuse to speak to me? Pilate said. And then listen to this. Don't you realize I have power? It's what people in power do, right? They like to remind us of how much power they wield. Don't you know who I am? You guys ever used that line before? I challenge you this week, if you're not getting your way somewhere, like your food's not coming fast enough, just say, don't you know who I am? Then you'll realize quickly how much power you have. It's 0, okay? But for someone like Pilate, he really has power. And from a worldly perspective, he's speaking truth here. Don't you realize I have power? Specifically, what kind of power? To either free you or crucify you. In other words, he's trying to say to Jesus, your life rests in my hands at this moment in time. So if I'm asking you a question, you better respect me enough to answer me. That's the way this dynamic is playing out from Pilate's perspective, but from Jesus' perspective, that's not how it works. Don't you realize I have power either to free you or to crucify you? And Jesus answered, you would have no power over me if it were not given to you from above. And I want you to think about that dynamic as we seek to figure out why it's so important for Paul to speak to those and testify to those in positions of power. What is God really trying to accomplish through all of this? Later on in Acts chapter 4, you remember way back in Acts chapter 4? What happens? Peter and John are put on trial, as it were, before the Jewish authorities. We thought we put an end to this Jesus movement. Why are these guys still preaching? So they warn them, don't preach about Jesus again. And what did Peter famously respond? We don't answer to you. We answer to God. And we're going to do what's right in his eyes. And so they're threatened never to preach to Jesus again. They're sent on their way. They gather with the church. They report to them all that happened. Remember, this is their first taste of real opposition from those in positions of authority. And what do? They gather with the church and they begin to pray. And in that prayer, they quote from Psalm 2. And the second psalm is all about how futile it is when the rulers of the earth set themselves against the will of God. And from the church's perspective, that's exactly what was happening with Jesus. Is the Jewish authorities and the Roman authorities had conspired together against God and his anointed. And that's what they say. Indeed, Herod and Pontius Pilate met together with the Gentiles and the people of Israel in this city to conspire against your holy servant Jesus, whom you anointed. They did what your power and your will had decided beforehand should happen. You catch that? These men in positions of power thought it was up to them to determine what was going to happen next. And the point of the church is actually what happened next only happened because you had determined that's what was going to happen. So who really holds the power? Herod and Pilate? No, not even kind of. And I want you to think about that as we work through the end of Acts here. Let me ask you this question and a follow-up to it. Does God's kingdom need either help or permission from Rome in order to operate? Anybody want to answer that one? No. Absolutely not. So then, as a follow-up, do those who follow Jesus as king need Rome's help or permission in order to be faithful? No, we don't. Does that hold true for us today? Do we need help or permission from anyone in worldly positions of authority in order to carry out the will of our God faithfully? No. Because who's in charge? I want to end with this passage. And as we read through this, I want you to think about this. If Paul's real objective, if what God really wanted to be accomplished through Paul in having him appear before Felix and Festus and Agrippa and Caesar, if what he really wanted to unfold was that he either convert these men and or make an alliance with them so that they could work together in helping God's kingdom grow, then Paul failed miserably at both of those things. But what if that wasn't God's objective at all? What if he didn't need an alliance with the powers at work in this world? What if his real objective was to speak to these men in power and say to them clearly, Jesus is Christ, which is exactly what Paul preached to Felix. I'm going to remind you again, Christ is not Jesus' last name. Christ is a title, the Anointed One, Messiah. And in that title is a claim of authority and power and kingship and rulership and all that goes with it. And so to stand before a governor of Rome and declare Jesus is Christ, that is a political statement. And what that statement really says is that we don't answer to Caesar. Caesar does not hold power over this world. Only one does, and his name is Jesus. And I want to end today with this passage. Would you turn over with me, please, to Ephesians chapter 1, starting at verse 15. For this reason, Paul writes to the church in Ephesus, ever since I heard about your faith in the Lord Jesus and your love for all God's people, I have not stopped giving thanks for you, remembering you in my prayers. I keep asking that the God of our Lord Jesus Christ, the glorious Father, may give you the spirit of wisdom and revelation so that you may know him better. I pray that the eyes of your heart may be enlightened in order that you may know the hope to which he has called you, the riches of his glorious inheritance in his holy people, and his incomparably great power for us who believe. That power is the same as the mighty strength he exerted when he raised Christ from the dead and seated him at his right hand in the heavenly realms, far above all rule, all authority, all power, all dominion, and every name that is invoked, not only in the present age, but also in the one to come. And God placed all things under his feet and appointed him to be head over everything for the church, which is his body, the fullness of him who fills everything in every way. I encourage you to dwell on that passage over the next few weeks and think critically about what it means that Christ has authority over everything and everyone, and his is the highest name to be named. Why is Paul preaching to these men in authority? What is the goal, and what does God hope to accomplish through that? Think about that. And with that, the lesson is yours. Let's stand and let's sing this final song together.
The splendor of a king, clothed in majesty, let all the earth rejoice, all the earth rejoice. He wraps himself in light, and darkness tries to hide. It trembles at his voice, trembles at his voice. How great time is in his hands, beginning and the end, beginning and the end. The Godhead three in one. Father, Spirit, Son, the Lion and the Lamb, the Lion and the Lamb. How great is our God! Sing with me, how great is our God! And all will see how great is our God. How great is our God! Sing with me, how great is our God! And all will see how great is our God.